When Clara's mother found out she was carrying a child, she didn't scream, didn't weep, and didn't even ask who the father was. Instead, she marched Clara into the yard at dawn, her face hard as iron, her grip like shackles on Clara's arm. There were no explanations, no questions, no second chances. "You've stained this house," her mother hissed. "You won't stain it further." Before Clara had time to gather her shoes, she was pushed into the back of a wagon. The morning was bitter, frost biting her bare ankles. She was only 16, her belly barely beginning to swell, yet she felt the shame settle heavier than any winter snow. The neighbors didn't even look from their porches as the cart rattled past. They had already decided her fate with their silence. The road stretched longer than Clara had ever traveled. Each jolt of the wagon pressed splinters into her skin as she sat with her wrists bound in rope, the fibers scratching deep red lines across her flesh. Her mother drove the mule forward without a word, the back of her shawl stiff in the icy wind. Not once did she turn around. Not once did she glance at the daughter she was banishing. Hours later, the cart turned off the main road and onto a narrow trail that clawed upward into the hills. Trees crowded close, tall pines whispering in a tongue Clara didn't understand. The higher they climbed, the darker it grew. Birds scattered from the sound of wagon wheels crunching over frozen leaves. Clara's breath came in shallow clouds, her fear spilling into the cold air. Finally, the wagon jerked to a halt in a clearing where a cabin stood hunched beneath a slate sky. Smoke rose faintly from its chimney. Beside it, a man split logs with slow, measured strikes. He was enormous. His shoulders stretched broad beneath a ragged coat of deer hide. A beard thick as moss covered half his face. His hands gripped the axe like it was part of him. His hair hung unkempt, dark as the soil under snow. Clara's heart stuttered. Her mother called out, voice sharp and cold, "Jonas!" The man looked up but didn't reply. His eyes flicked once at Clara, then back to the log he was splitting. "This one's yours now," her mother said flatly. Clara felt her breath vanish. "Mama, please." The slap came without warning, the sting searing across her cheek. "Don't call me that." Her mother's eyes burned, not with sorrow but with disgust. "You've made your choice. Now live with it." Jonas set the axe aside. He didn't move closer, didn't speak. He only nodded once, a gesture that felt more like acknowledgement of burden than acceptance of another human life. Her mother untied the rope roughly, shoving Clara forward. The girl stumbled into the dirt, knees striking hard. Her palms stung, but not as much as the hollowness spreading in her chest. Without another glance, her mother climbed back into the wagon. The mule lurched forward, hooves cracking ice on the ground. Clara scrambled to her feet, heart clawing toward the retreating figure. "Please, don't leave me here!" But the wagon kept rolling down the mountain trail until it was nothing more than a shadow swallowed by trees. Clara stood barefoot in the clearing, tears freezing on her cheeks, while Jonas turned silently and walked toward the cabin. The door creaked as he pushed it open with his shoulder. He didn't wait for her, he didn't beckon her inside. He simply disappeared into the dim glow within, leaving her alone with the smell of wood smoke and the echo of her own sobbing. For a long time, Clara didn't move. Her hands cradled her belly out of instinct, as if protecting the small spark of life inside from the cruelty of the world outside. Finally, the cold drove her forward. She crept toward the cabin, each step heavier than the last. Inside, warmth slapped her skin, the sudden change dizzying her. A fire snapped in the hearth, shadows dancing across rough wooden walls. Furs hung from hooks, a rifle rested above the mantel, a narrow cot sagged in the corner. It was not a home, it was survival dressed in timber and ash. Clara stepped across the threshold and the door swung shut behind her with the wind's push. She startled, hugging herself. Jonas sat at the table, sharpening a knife with long, deliberate strokes. He didn't look up. Her throat tightened. "Why am I here?" she whispered. Jonas said nothing. The rasp of stone against steel was his only reply. "I didn't ask for this," Clara continued, voice cracking. Still silence. She bit her lip until she tasted blood, then sank down by the fire. Her body shook from exhaustion, fear, and the weight of a future she couldn't yet name. That night, Clara lay on the floor beside the hearth, too afraid to touch the cot that surely belonged to him. The flames painted her face in shifting gold. She curled around her stomach, whispering to the child she carried. "You're all I have," she murmured. Jonas moved once during the night. His boots thudded on the floorboards. Clara froze, pretending to sleep. He tossed a blanket down near her before returning to the shadows. She waited until his breathing steadied before pulling it over herself, clutching its coarse fabric like a lifeline. In that moment, a thought pressed through her fear, a fragile ember of hope. Perhaps he wasn't going to harm her. Perhaps he would simply ignore her. But she didn't know yet which fate was worse. The morning crept in through gaps between the cabin's logs, streaks of pale light catching on floating dust. Clara stirred on the floor, stiff from the hard boards. Her body ached everywhere, especially her wrists where rope burns had scabbed overnight. She blinked against the glow of the hearth's embers. Jonas was already gone. For a moment she wondered if he had left her, vanished into the woods like a ghost, and she would be alone here until hunger or cold finished what her mother had started. But then she heard the faint rhythm of an axe outside, each strike echoing through the trees like a drumbeat. Clara rose slowly, wrapping the coarse blanket tighter around her shoulders. Her stomach growled, sharp and hollow. She hadn't eaten since the day before, unless fear could be counted as sustenance. On the table lay the 2 rabbits Jonas had skinned last night, their meat stripped and set aside. A knife rested beside them, clean and sharp. Clara hesitated, then reached for the basin. She had watched her mother cook meat 1,000 times, though she herself had never been trusted near the fire. Her hands trembled as she tried to recall the steps. She salted the meat, clumsily laying it in a pan she found hanging on the wall. The smell of sizzling flesh soon filled the air, both nauseating and comforting. For the first time since her banishment, the cabin smelled of something like home. The door opened suddenly. Clara flinched, nearly dropping the pan. Jonas entered, shoulders dusted with snow, arms burdened with freshly cut wood. He set it by the hearth, glancing once at the pan before meeting her eyes. She froze under his gaze. I tried, she stammered. Jonas grunted, neither approving nor condemning, before moving to the basin to wash his hands. He ate in silence minutes later, tearing into the cooked meat with the steady focus of a man who had known hunger too many times to waste words on food. Clara picked at her portion cautiously, unsure if she was allowed. When he didn't object, she nibbled, the taste both strange and grounding. Afterward, Jonas rose, took his coat, and left without a word. The silence he left behind pressed on Clara's chest like weight. She stared at the flames until her eyes blurred. Days passed this way. Jonas left before dawn, returned after dusk, always with something meat, wood, pelts. He spoke only when necessary, and even then in words clipped and flat. Hand me the pot. Keep the fire fed. Shut the shutter. Clara obeyed because she didn't know what else to do. At first, she thought he resented her presence. Perhaps he did, but she began noticing small things, gestures so subtle they nearly escaped her. A second bowl laid on the table, never offered but always placed. A blanket folded near the fire, cleaner than the one he'd first tossed her. Boots left by the door, the soles mended roughly but deliberately, her boots, though she hadn't asked. He was not kind, but he was not cruel. And to Clara, who had known only the harsh edge of her mother's hand and the sharper edge of her father's silence before his death, that difference mattered more than she could admit. On the 5th morning, Clara woke to dampness on her dress. At first, she thought it was sweat, then she saw the blood. A scream tore from her throat before she could stop it. Panic rushed in, faster than breath, drowning her. She clutched her stomach, sobbing. Jonas burst through the door, snow still clinging to his beard, axe in hand. His eyes widened as they fell to the crimson stain spreading across her lap. "I'm bleeding," Clara choked out. "It's too early, I can't. Please, I don't know what to do." For the first time since she had met him, Jonas moved without hesitation. He dropped the axe, scooped her into his arms as though she weighed nothing, and carried her to the cot. His hands were steady, but his jaw clenched, eyes flickering with something she hadn't seen before. Fear. He stoked the fire high, boiled water, brought every fur in the cabin to lay over her trembling body. His large hands pressed firmly but gently against her thighs, checking, controlling the bleeding. Hours passed in agony. Clara clutched his sleeve, whispering through tears, "Please not the baby, please not the baby." Jonas said nothing, but once, just once, she felt his hand tremble. By nightfall, the bleeding slowed, the cramps dulled, exhaustion stole her voice until she drifted into restless sleep. When she awoke, Jonas was seated against the wall beside the cot, head bowed, arms draped over his knees. The fire painted his face in tired orange. "You cared," Clara whispered, her throat raw. Jonas didn't move. "Don't flatter yourself." But his voice cracked on the words. She smiled faintly, then closed her eyes again. The storm came days later. It howled down from the mountain like a beast, burying the porch in snow and rattling the shutters. For 5 days they were trapped together, with dwindling food and the endless shriek of wind. Clara tried to help where she could, patching leaks with cloth, feeding the fire, mending her dress with clumsy stitches. But on the 3rd day, she slipped on the ice near the door while fetching snow for water. She hit her elbow hard, pain shooting through her arm. Jonas caught her before she could stand. "What were you thinking?" His voice rose, rough and angry, the first time she had heard it above a mutter. I needed water," Clara stammered. "You were asleep." Jonas grabbed a strip of cloth, moving toward her. She flinched instinctively, shoulders curling. He froze. "I'm not your father," he said, voice lower now. "You don't need to expect a blow." Clara's breath hitched. She met his eyes, startled by the gentleness there. You don't hit me?" she whispered. His jaw tightened. "I won't, even if you mouth off." Tears pricked her eyes. She whispered, "You're the first man who's ever said that to me." Jonas looked away, wrapping her arm carefully. His hands, so large and calloused, were strangely tender. That night, Clara didn't lie on the floor. She sat on the cot, silent tears tracing her cheeks, while Jonas sharpened his knife in the dark. He didn't tell her to move. He didn't scold her for crying. He simply sat there, listening. And for the first time since her mother's wagon rolled away, Clara felt something fragile flicker in her chest. Not safety, not yet. But possibility. The storm finally broke, but the world it left behind was no less cruel. Snowdrifts towered against the cabin walls, and the trail down the mountain had vanished entirely. The silence after the wind's fury felt heavier than the storm itself, pressing on Clara's chest like a warning that peace was never free. Jonas was gone longer each day now. He returned after dusk, shoulders hunched under the weight of wood or meat, his beard frosted white, his breath ragged. He never explained where he went or how far he traveled. Clara didn't ask. She didn't dare. But she noticed the way his hands shook sometimes when he sat by the fire, as though he was holding something back. Her belly grew steadily beneath her patched dress. Jonas didn't speak of it, didn't ask how far along she was, but Clara caught him watching her sometimes when he thought she wasn't looking. His gaze wasn't cruel, it wasn't even curious. It was protective in a way that unsettled her, because she didn't know how to bear it. One night, as she cleaned the basin, a wave of dizziness slammed into her. She staggered, nearly spilling the water, her vision tunneling, her skin burned and froze all at once. By the time Jonas noticed, she was already trembling on the cot, teeth chattering so violently she could barely form words. "Fever," she gasped. Jonas was at her side in seconds, his hand pressed against her forehead and his eyes darkened. Without a word, he bolted to the door, pulled on his coat, and disappeared into the snowstorm. Clara clutched her belly, fear and heat warring inside her. Every minute stretched like an hour. She whispered to the child inside her, over and over, "Hold on, please hold on." Jonas did not return that night, nor the next day. Clara drifted in and out of delirium, the fire crackling faintly in the corners of her awareness. She thought she heard boots once, but when she called out, only silence answered. On the 2nd night, she sobbed into the blanket, certain he had abandoned her, that she would die in this cabin just as her mother had meant her to. But on the 3rd morning, the door crashed open. Jonas staggered inside, face raw from windburn, lips cracked and bleeding, hands swollen nearly black from frostbite. He dropped a bundle on the table, herbs, cloth, a flask filled with something that smelled sharp and bitter. Then he fell to his knees, catching himself on the table with a grunt. Clara cried out. She tried to rise, but her body betrayed her. Jonas forced himself upright, ignoring his injuries, and moved to her side. He pressed the warm flask to her lips. "Drink." The liquid burned down her throat, strange but soothing. She coughed, gasped, and swallowed again. Hours passed in a haze. Jonas tended her with quiet urgency, changing the damp cloths on her forehead, wrapping her in furs, whispering gruff reassurances even when she couldn't answer. His hands shook, not from uncertainty but from exhaustion, as if he had held himself together for too long. By the next dawn, the fever broke. Clara woke drenched in sweat, her breath shallow but steady. Jonas sat slumped in the chair beside the cot, his eyes half closed, his body gaunt. "You came back," she whispered. His eyes flicked open. "Course I did." "You could have let the fever," her voice cracked. "You could have let it do the work." Jonas shook his head once. "I'm not your mother." Tears spilled down Clara's cheeks. It wasn't just the words, it was the way he said them, as if they carried the weight of a promise he would never let himself break. Spring came late, clawing its way down the mountain as though reluctant to thaw the world. Ice clung stubbornly to the roof. Mud swallowed the trail. The cold lingered even when the trees tried to wake again. Clara grew stronger, though her body still carried scars of fever. Her belly was unmistakable now, the swell of life impossible to ignore. Jonas never spoke of it, but his quiet gestures multiplied. He left bread by the hearth in the mornings. He boiled water for her baths. He mended her dress clumsily when it tore, his stitches uneven but careful. Sometimes she found little carvings left on the windowsill, tiny animals shaped from wood. A bird with spread wings, a fox with a crooked tail. Jonas never admitted they were his, but Clara knew. One evening, he returned with something unexpected, a dog half-starved, ribs sharp beneath its matted fur. It limped badly on its hind leg, eyes wild with desperation. Clara gasped. "Where did you—" "Trapline," Jonas muttered. "Followed me home." The creature collapsed near the hearth, too weak to stand. Clara knelt beside it, stroking its rough coat. "We'll call him Ash," she said softly, "because he's clinging to warmth." Jonas grunted but didn't object. That night, when the wind whistled cold through the chimney, he laid another pelt near the fire for the dog. Within days, Ash became Clara's shadow, curling against her legs whenever she sat, growling low whenever footsteps crunched too near the cabin. Jonas pretended not to notice, but Clara caught the ghost of a smile hidden beneath his beard. Weeks later, while Jonas sharpened his blade by the window, Clara felt a sudden kick against her ribs. She gasped, hand flying to her belly. Jonas turned. For once, his eyes met hers directly. "She's moving," Clara whispered, tears brimming. Jonas's face softened, though his voice remained low. "How far along?" 6 months, give or take." Silence hung heavy for a moment. Then Jonas asked, "Is the father gone?" Clara's throat closed. She stared at the floor. "He was never a father. He was the miller's son. Promised me marriage, promised me love. But when I told him I was late, he said I'd tried to trap him. He told his father I was wicked." Her voice broke. "And my mother believed him enough to throw me away." Jonas's jaw clenched. His hands tightened, but his voice was softer than she expected. "I'm sorry." Clara blinked, startled. "For what?" "For how they treated you." He didn't say it like an apology could undo it. He said it like he knew it couldn't, but it mattered anyway. She stared at him, searching his unreadable face. "Then why did you take me?" Jonas hesitated. "I owed your mother." The words stung sharper than any slap. Clara's eyes filled. "So she gave you me in return?" Jonas shook his head. "No, she said she had someone who needed a place. Said you were difficult. I thought it meant another hand for chores. Then I saw your face. The bruises, the way you flinched, that wasn't difficult. That was abandoned." Clara pressed a trembling hand to her belly. "And you still let me stay." Jonas looked at her for a long moment. His dark eyes held something she couldn't yet name. "I wasn't about to let you drown." That night Clara dreamed of rivers. She dreamed of icy water closing over her head, of hands pulling her out when she thought she would sink forever. When she woke, Jonas was sitting near the fire, his gaze fixed on the flames. And for the first time, she didn't feel like a prisoner in the cabin. She felt like she had been rescued. The weeks crept by, each day longer than the last. Clara counted them by the firewood stacked near the door, by the fading snow on the eaves, by the restless kicks that drummed from inside her. Her belly swelled so large that she could no longer bend without pain. Each step was heavy, each night sleepless. Jonas noticed, though he never said much. He fetched water without being asked. He boiled baths when her back ached. He built a stool beside the fire so she could sit while she worked. He was always watching, always noticing, though he pretended otherwise. Clara often caught him carving in the evenings. She never asked what. But one night, when she rose from the cot to fetch more firewood, she saw it a cradle, half-finished, tucked behind the cabin. Made of pine, smoothed with patience, tiny foxes etched into the sides. Her hand trembled as she touched it. Jonas said nothing when he found her there. He only walked past, his silence carrying more than words ever could. The baby came early. It began with cramps deep in Clara's belly, sharper than any she had felt before. At first she tried to hide them, biting her lip until she tasted blood. But before dawn, the pain ripped through her so violently she screamed. Jonas was at her side instantly. He didn't ask what to do, he simply moved. He boiled water, laid out cloths, stacked furs near the fire. His large hands, so steady when splitting wood, trembled only once as he brushed Clara's damp hair from her forehead. "Breathe," he muttered. "You're strong, almost there." Clara gripped his hand so tightly he winced, but he never pulled away. Each wave of pain tore her apart, yet his voice anchored her through it. "You're not alone, not anymore." Hours blurred into agony. She screamed until her throat was raw, sweat soaking her dress. She thought she might die. She thought the baby might too. But Jonas never left her side. He whispered encouragements that didn't make sense but mattered anyway. Finally a cry pierced the cabin. Not hers, not his, the shrill wail of new life. Jonas held the tiny child in his scarred hands, eyes wide with something Clara had never seen before. Reverence, fear. "It's a girl," he whispered, voice breaking. Clara sobbed as he wrapped the child in cloth and placed her gently in her arms. The baby's fists curled, her face scrunched and red, her cry fierce. Clara pressed her close, heart splitting open with a love she had thought she'd never feel. "What will you name her?" Jonas asked softly. Clara stared at the fragile miracle in her arms. "Grace," she whispered, "because she's more than I deserve." Jonas nodded once, but his eyes glistened when he looked at them both. That night, as Grace slept in Clara's arms, Jonas dragged the cot closer to the fire. He pulled up a chair beside it, settling near mother and child. He didn't speak. He only sat there, watching over them, as if daring the world to try and take them away. 3 days later, a knock rattled the cabin door. It wasn't loud, just 2 firm raps. Clara startled, clutching Grace tighter. Jonas set down the knife he had been sharpening and crossed to the door in silence. When he opened it, a boy stood on the porch, no older than 15, thin and pale, boots caked with mud. He held his hat nervously in his hands. "Sir," the boy said, voice cracking, "I'm looking for my sister. Her name's Clara." Clara gasped. She rose so fast the chair toppled behind her. "Samuel?" The boy's eyes lit up. "Clara, they told us you were dead. Mama, she said." His words tangled in his throat. Clara stepped outside barefoot. Grace pressed to her chest. Snow bit her toes, but she didn't feel it. "They told you I was dead?" Samuel nodded quickly. "Mama said Father lied, said he told the town you ran off, that you shamed us and drowned yourself. But when she got sick, she told me the truth, told me where he took you. She begged me to find you." Clara's heart pounded. Her knees nearly buckled. "Mama!" "She's dying," Samuel whispered. "Her lungs. She wanted to see you before it's too late." Behind her, Jonas stood silent in the doorway, his face unreadable but his eyes sharp. "Why now?" he asked the boy. "Because Father's gone," Samuel replied. "Left in the night after the sheriff started asking questions about the miller's son. People are talking. Clara, they're asking what really happened. Mama said, she said to bring you home if I could." Clara's breath caught. Home. The word sounded like both salvation and a curse. She looked down at Grace, then back at Jonas. His jaw was clenched, but he didn't speak. That night, Samuel slept curled by the fire, coat folded under his head. Clara sat on the cot, Grace nestled against her, mind spinning. Jonas sat at the table, sharpening his knife with slow, steady strokes. Neither spoke, but Clara felt the question burning in the silence. Would she go back? In the morning, Clara tried to find an answer. She cooked oats in silence, fed Grace, watched her brother stir awake with eyes heavy from travel. He was so thin, so tired. He looked at her with admiration and trust she didn't know how to bear. "Mama doesn't have long," he said softly. "She wants your forgiveness before." He trailed off. Clara stared at the fire. Anger coiled inside her. "She didn't protect me, Sam. She let him give me away like I was nothing." Samuel's face crumpled. "She tried. I swear she did. But Father threatened to send her away too. She was too weak, not like you." Clara laughed bitterly. "I wasn't strong. I was just left behind." "No," Samuel whispered. "You got out." Jonas came in then, arms heavy with kindling. He set it by the hearth and knelt to feed the flames. Clara looked at him, desperate for guidance. "She's dying," she said. Jonas didn't look up. "You don't have to decide right now." But Clara knew she did. She had a daughter now. She had Grace. She had a life carved from ruin. Could she risk stepping back into the world that had cast her out? That night, as Grace slept, Clara packed a small bag, enough for a few days. Jonas gave her one of his coats. It swallowed her whole, but she took it anyway. "I won't stay long," she told him quietly. Just long enough to see her, long enough to know the truth. Jonas's eyes softened, though his voice was rough. You come back. Clara squeezed his hand. I will. The road down the mountain was worse than she remembered. Frozen ruts, icy ridges, mud sucking at their mules' hooves. Samuel walked beside her, helping when she stumbled, his youthful face set with determination beyond his years. Grace whimpered in her arms, but Clara hushed her with soft songs, each note trembling with both fear and resolve. When the town finally came into view, Clara's heart clenched. Nothing had changed, the sawdust smell, the whisper of voices waiting to condemn. But when people looked at her this time, there was something different in their eyes, not pity, not shame, something like uncertainty. She walked with her head high, Samuel at her side, Grace pressed close. Not a single person called her a name. Her mother was dying. The doctor said her lungs were failing, fever high, days left at most. Clara found her curled small in bed, face hollow, eyes clouded. Clara, she rasped, reaching with frail fingers. My baby. Clara sat at her side, laying Grace gently in her arms. For a moment, silence held them, broken only by the baby's tiny breaths. I'm sorry, her mother whispered. I should have protected you. Clara's throat burned. You should have. Her mother's eyes filled with tears. I know. Forgiveness didn't come like a flood. It came in a fragile whisper, in a shared look between mother, daughter, and granddaughter. Clara stayed 3 days, long enough to hear the sheriff had arrested the miller's son, long enough to watch her mother slip quietly from this world, long enough to stand in her father's empty chair and realize he was never coming back. When she left the house for the last time, Samuel at her side and Grace in her arms, Clara whispered to herself, I already have a home. And she knew exactly where it was. The journey back to the mountain took 3 days. Clara felt every step. The mule struggled against the muddy trail, and Samuel's thin frame grew wearier by the hour. Grace cried often, her small body unsettled by the jostling, but Clara kept her close, whispering lullabies with a strength she didn't know she had. When the cabin finally came into view, smoke curling from the chimney, snow melting in patchy clumps, Clara's chest tightened. Jonas stood on the porch, axe in hand, his figure steady against the gray sky. He stepped forward when he saw them. You came back, he said. Clara smiled, exhaustion breaking into relief. Told you I would. Without another word, she placed Grace in his arms. Jonas looked down at the child, cradling her with surprising ease. Grace blinked up at him, tiny fists curling in the air. She's heavier now, he murmured. She eats like her mother, Clara teased through tired laughter. The three of them stepped into the cabin together, Samuel trailing behind, eyes wide with both curiosity and awe. For the first time, Clara felt the space wasn't just Jonas's, not just a cabin carved from wilderness. It was home. Life settled into a new rhythm. Samuel took to chores eagerly, splitting wood, hauling water, anything to prove his worth. Clara cooked, sewed, and tended to Grace, often rocking her in the cradle Jonas had finished with quiet devotion. Jonas hunted, trapped, and brought home more than before, as if the weight of their lives had doubled on his shoulders, but he carried it without complaint. There was grief woven into their days, yes. Clara felt it when she opened the cupboard and saw her mother's old jar tucked among the supplies, when Samuel coughed in the thin morning air, when Jonas sat silently near the fire, eyes distant. But grief no longer defined them. Grace's laughter filled the cabin now, so did Samuel's growing confidence. Even Jonas's silence had softened into something that felt less like solitude and more like steadiness. Still, danger lingered. Clara noticed it first in the way Jonas paused at the window some evenings, gaze fixed on the tree line. He sharpened his rifle more often, checked his traps twice a day. Something's wrong, Clara whispered one night as Grace slept in her arms. Jonas nodded slowly. Heard gunfire in the woods. Not mine. Not game either. Her stomach tightened. Do you think they'll come here? Maybe. His jaw clenched. But if they do, they'll find we're not easy prey. The knock came 2 weeks later. It was midday. Clara was swaddling Grace, Samuel chopping wood outside, Jonas repairing a broken chair. When the knock rattled the door, Jonas froze. His hand brushed instinctively against the rifle by the wall. He opened it cautiously. On the porch stood a man Clara didn't know. He wore a long coat, a shotgun strapped across his back, and a badge pinned to his chest. His face was lined, his blonde hair graying at the edges. Name's Bram, he said, tipping his hat. I'm a marshal. Came from 2 towns over looking for a girl, Clara." Clara stepped into view, Grace in her arms. "Why?" Bram studied her a moment. "Because there's trouble brewing. The miller's son didn't take kindly to being arrested. His father, the preacher, he's stirring up folks. Some want blood. They say you led a good man into sin." Clara's chest burned. "They already branded me guilty once." The marshal's gaze softened. "Your brother told the town what your father did. Folks are listening now. Some are on your side, some not." He looked at Jonas. "If they come, they'll come here." Jonas's grip on the doorframe tightened. "Then let them come." Bram sighed. "I just came to warn you, and to tell you there are people who believe you. Don't give up on that." He tipped his hat again and left, boots crunching through snow until he disappeared down the trail. Silence lingered long after. Jonas shut the door, his shoulders tense. Clara clutched Grace tighter, whispering to herself, "We're not running again." 2 nights later, Samuel spotted them first. "Jonas," he hissed from the window. "There, by the trees." 3 men moved at the edge of the clearing, shadows in the moonlight. One carried a long rifle, another held a rope. The third lugged a burlap sack that clinked like bottles. "They're here to burn us out," Jonas muttered, reaching for his rifle. Clara's heart pounded. "We can leave. Please, we can take Grace and go." Jonas shook his head. "If we run now, they'll chase us forever. Better they learn we're not helpless." He handed Clara a pistol, the one he had taught her to hold weeks earlier. "Stay close to the baby. If anyone gets past me, you shoot." Samuel stepped forward, clutching a long stick like it was a sword. "I'm not hiding." Jonas crouched before him, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You're brave, but brave men know when to protect instead of fight. Your sister needs you. Grace needs you." Samuel's throat worked, but he nodded and stepped back inside, shutting the door. The first shot came low, scattering snow at the porch. Jonas fired back, dropping to one knee with calm precision. Clara ducked behind the beams, pistol trembling in her grip. One man charged from the trees. Jonas dropped him with a shot to the leg. The others hesitated, surprised by resistance. Then a figure emerged, taller, older. Clara's breath froze. The preacher. "I only came to speak," he called, voice carrying. "You brought guns to talk," Jonas growled. "You've shamed this town," the preacher spat. "You birthed sin and dragged it into the world." Clara stepped forward, her pistol shaking but raised. "This child is no sin. She's my daughter. She's life." The preacher sneered. "Filth breeds filth." Jonas leveled his rifle. "Then why are you the one covered in mud?" The preacher's face twisted with rage. He stepped forward, but a new voice cut through the night. "Leave them be!" Samuel. He had climbed a tree, his young voice ringing strong. "She's my sister. That baby's my family. You want them? You come through me too." The preacher faltered. His men shifted uneasily. Then another voice joined, a calm, firm tone. The marshal rode up from the trail, rifle raised. "This ends here," Bram said, "or it ends with a rope." The preacher froze. His men backed away. Rage burned in his eyes, but he turned and vanished into the woods. Inside the cabin, silence reigned. Jonas leaned the rifle against the wall, shoulders tight. Clara lowered her pistol, her hands still trembling. Grace stirred in her cradle, her small cry piercing the heavy air. Clara scooped her up, pressing her close. "We're safe," she whispered, though her voice shook. Jonas's gaze softened as he watched her. For now. She looked at him, meeting his dark eyes with a steadiness she hadn't known she possessed. "Then we'll keep fighting, because this is our family now." For the first time since she had arrived, Jonas's lips curved into the faintest ghost of a smile. The mountain air felt sharper in the weeks after the preacher's retreat. It was cleaner somehow, but Clara sensed danger lingering, like smoke after a fire. Jonas grew more vigilant, setting extra traps near the clearing and keeping his rifle propped by the door at all times. Samuel walked with a new pride, though Clara saw the tension in his young shoulders. And Grace laughed louder, as if she didn't know the world outside still carried poison. Clara clung to that laughter. It was the only sound that convinced her the fight had been worth it. But peace was never promised. The letter arrived one morning, tied to a stone that shattered the window. The rock skidded across the floor, wrapped in parchment. Jonas picked it up, his jaw tightening as he read. "What does it say?" Clara asked, clutching Grace. Jonas handed her the paper. The words were scrawled in a jagged hand. "The child is an abomination. The mother's sin lingers. He who shelters them will answer for both. We haven't forgotten. We're coming." Clara's hands didn't shake this time. She had been afraid for so long, but fear had burned into something else now. Resolve. "They still think they can scare us," she said, her voice steady. "They might not be wrong," Jonas muttered. She turned to him sharply. "Not because we're weak," he added quickly. "Because we have something to lose." His eyes flicked to Grace. That night, they began to prepare. Jonas showed Samuel how to rig snares that would trip a man instead of catch a rabbit. Clara boiled jars of stew and tucked them into a root cellar Jonas had dug. They didn't speak much about what was coming, but every action carried the weight of unspoken understanding. The past wasn't finished with them. A week later, Jonas returned from the northern trail bleeding from his shoulder. Clara cried out when she saw the crimson staining his coat. "What happened?" she demanded, pulling him inside. "Trap," he grunted. "Wasn't mine." Clara's stomach twisted. Someone had laid it for him. This wasn't just words anymore. It was war. She cleaned the wound with shaking hands while Samuel held a lantern steady. Jonas flinched but didn't complain. Clara's tears fell silently, burning her cheeks as she whispered, "They won't stop until they take everything." Jonas caught her wrist gently. "Then we don't let them." At dawn, Jonas led Clara and Samuel to the high ridge. From there, the valley spread wide like a map. Smoke curled from a campfire near the river, too close to their trail for comfort. "They're watching," Clara whispered. Jonas nodded grimly. "They want us to feel hunted." She clenched her fists, feeling Grace stir in the sling across her chest. "Then let's remind them we're not prey." Jonas looked at her, surprise flickering in his eyes. She didn't flinch, not anymore. The confrontation came sooner than expected. 3 men moved through the woods near dusk, stepping quiet as shadows. One carried a rope, another a rifle, the third bottles clinking in his pack. Jonas had been waiting since first light, crouched in the brush with his rifle. Samuel hid nearby with a stick sharpened into a spear, determined to prove himself. Clara, heart hammering, crouched above in a tree, pistol tucked into her waistband, knife in her boot. The first man fell into a snare Samuel had set. He hit the ground hard, the wind knocked out of him. Samuel leapt forward, holding his sharpened stick like a sword. "Don't move!" he shouted, his voice cracking but fierce. The second man raised his rifle, but Jonas stepped from cover, his own weapon aimed steady. "Drop it." The man froze. The third tried to run, but Clara dropped from the tree, landing hard and knocking him to the ground. She pressed the pistol to his head, her breath ragged. "You came for a baby," she hissed. "Now answer for it." They tied the men, searched their packs. The bottles reeked of kerosene. They had planned to burn the cabin, with Grace inside. That was the line. The marshal came the next day. Bram studied the tied men, his jaw tight. "I'll take them in," he said, "but they won't be the only ones." "You knew," Jonas growled. Bram sighed. "I heard whispers, took time to track them. I'm here now." Clara stepped forward, Grace clinging to her shoulder. "They wanted to kill a child," she said flatly. Bram's eyes softened. "And you stopped them. That matters." The trial was quiet, but word spread louder than the verdict itself. Men loyal to the preacher were arrested. The preacher himself vanished into the night, leaving only fear behind. For the first time, Clara felt something stir in the town. Not contempt, not shame, but reckoning. Weeks later, when spring warmed the mountain and the snow finally melted from the roof, Clara found Jonas carving something by the fire. His rough hands worked patiently over a small piece of walnut. "What are you making?" she asked softly, Grace asleep in her arms. Jonas hesitated, then handed it to her, a ring, carved simple but smooth. "I never thought I'd ask anyone," he said, his voice low, "but I can't not." Clara's breath caught. "Jonas?" "You already said yes," he muttered, almost embarrassed. She slipped the ring onto her finger, tears blurring her vision. It didn't need gold or polish. It was carved from the same mountain that had saved them. Jonas looked at her, his eyes softer than she had ever seen them. "You're not what they said you were. You're more." Clara reached for his hand. "So are you." For the first time, Jonas smiled fully. It was small, crooked, but it lit his face in a way that made Clara's chest ache. They had been bound by punishment, by fear, by survival. Now they were bound by choice. But the past wasn't finished. One morning a rider appeared on the trail. His coat was black, his posture rigid, his face weathered. He dismounted carefully, removed his hat, and spoke with authority. "Sheriff Bernard Lyle," he introduced himself. I don't mean trouble. I came because of the trial." Clara's heart tightened. "We found a ledger," the sheriff continued. "Preacher kept records, names, families who gave up daughters, men who paid. Your father's name is there." Her stomach dropped. The sheriff met her gaze. "Your testimony can make sure this never happens again, but it's your choice." Clara stood frozen. The cabin had been her salvation. The thought of returning to town filled her with dread. But the ledger, the truth, was a chance to protect more girls from what she had endured. That night, as Grace slept in her cradle, Clara sat by the fire with Jonas. "I don't know if I can face them," she whispered. "What if I'm not strong enough?" Jonas's hand covered hers, rough and warm. "You're stronger than me. I've seen war, and I've never seen anyone fight like you." Clara's throat tightened. "Then you'll stand with me?" "Always." 3 days later, Clara walked into town with Jonas at her side. Samuel stayed behind to guard Grace, his young face solemn with duty. The courthouse was small but packed. Other girls sat in the front row, some older, some heartbreakingly young. Each had a name written once in that ledger. Clara stood tall, her voice steady as she told her story. She didn't cry, she didn't break. She spoke of betrayal, of abandonment, of survival. She spoke of how she had been traded like cattle and how she had lived anyway. By the time she finished, the room was silent. People wept, some bowed their heads in shame. The preacher was declared wanted across 3 states. Her father, already hiding, was arrested. No one spoke in his defense. When Clara left the courthouse, Jonas walked beside her, his hand steady on her back. She breathed deep, the air sharper but freer than it had ever been. For the first time, Clara felt like her story wasn't just hers anymore. It belonged to every girl who had ever been silenced. And she knew she had found her purpose. The mountain seemed different after Clara's testimony. The wind no longer howled warnings through the pines. Instead, it hummed quietly, as though the ridge itself had listened to her voice and recognized something unbreakable in it. Life did not become easy. Nothing in the wilderness ever was, but it became theirs. Samuel stayed. He took to the work with a fierceness that made Clara's chest ache with both pride and sorrow. He chopped wood until his arms trembled, fixed traps under Jonas's instruction, and began to smile again, hesitant at first, then fuller as the days passed. It was as if he had been invisible all his life, and only now did he understand what it felt like to matter. Clara watched him one morning as he carried a bundle of logs inside, cheeks flushed from the cold. "You don't have to work yourself sick," she told him. Samuel shrugged. "Feels good to be needed." "You've always been needed," Clara said softly. His eyes flicked to Grace, gurgling in her cradle, then to Jonas sharpening a blade by the fire. "Not like this," he whispered. Jonas had changed too. His silence remained, but it no longer pressed on the cabin like a wall. It felt steady now, dependable, the silence of a man who listened instead of hiding. He corrected Samuel's grip on an axe with patient movements. He stitched the soles of Clara's boots without being asked. He even carved small toys for Grace, wooden foxes, owls, and bears, lining them neatly on the mantel as though they were soldiers guarding her dreams. Clara often caught him watching the baby when he thought no one noticed, his rough hands resting gently on the cradle he had built. His eyes softened in a way that made Clara's breath catch. Sometimes she wondered what he saw when he looked at Grace. Maybe the life he thought he'd never have. Maybe redemption he never thought he deserved. Whatever it was love. She could see it even if he never said the word. One night, a storm rolled in hard. Snow battered the windows, wind howling like wolves circling the cabin. Inside, they huddled close to the fire. Clara rocked Grace in her arms. Samuel dragged his bunk closer, and Jonas sat at the table sharpening a blade, though his gaze kept drifting to her. Clara finally broke the silence. "You used to be alone up here, didn't you?" Jonas didn't look up. "Still am sometimes." She tilted her head. "We're not going anywhere." "I know." His voice was quiet, almost lost in the storm. "But I don't always believe it yet." Clara frowned. "Why?" Jonas's hand stilled on the blade. His eyes met hers, dark and unreadable. "You ever try to save something that didn't want saving?" Clara thought of her mother, her father, the miller's son. She swallowed hard. "Yes." "It don't work," he muttered. "No," she agreed softly, "but sometimes you try anyway." Grace stirred in her arms, a tiny whimper. Clara kissed her forehead and whispered, "Do you think she'll forgive me for bringing her into a world like this?" Jonas rose slowly and crossed the room. He knelt beside her, his hand brushing over the baby's head as though he feared breaking her. "She already has," he said. The storm raged outside, but inside Clara felt something settle into place. Spring arrived like a miracle. One day the woods were gray and brittle, the next they burst with green. Birds returned, streams ran full, and Grace took her first wobbly steps in the soft grass outside the cabin. Her laughter carried across the ridge, pure as sunlight. Clara wept the first time she saw it. "I thought she'd grow up in fear," she whispered. Jonas's voice rumbled low beside her. "She'll grow up free." But the thaw brought more than new life. One morning Jonas returned from the trapline carrying a letter. No rider had delivered it. It had been tied to a tree, left like bait. Clara unfolded the paper with trembling fingers. The words were cruel. "You may have fooled the town. But God sees, we see. A bastard child cannot erase sin. The mountains won't hide you forever." Clara's stomach twisted, but her hands did not shake. "They still think I'm afraid," she said quietly. Jonas's gaze was steady. "Are you?" She looked at Grace toddling nearby, Samuel showing her how to toss pebbles into the stream. Not anymore. Preparations became part of their life. Samuel learned to shoot under Jonas's guidance. Clara kept herbs dried and ready for wounds or fever. They built a stronger pen for the mule, reinforced the shutters, stored extra food. It wasn't paranoia, it was survival. Yet life wasn't only about danger anymore. It was about Grace's laughter. About Samuel learning to whittle under Jonas's instruction. About Clara discovering she could smile without guilt. One evening, Jonas stood in the doorway, watching the sun sink over the ridge. Clara came beside him, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders. "What is it?" she asked softly. "Used to think I was just waiting," Jonas murmured, "waiting to fade into these woods. Like I was hollowed out," he paused, eyes fixed on the horizon. "But maybe I was being carved into something, like wood for a ring, cut, shaped, stronger because of it." Clara slipped her hand into his. "You weren't carved to carry nothing, Jonas. You were shaped to carry us." He turned to her then, his dark eyes softer than she'd ever seen. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. That night, as they lay side by side, Grace breathing softly in her cradle, Clara realized she was no longer surviving. She was living. Winter returned slower than before. The woods gave up their color reluctantly, clinging to green as long as possible. Squirrels darted under the porch, birds flew lower, and the nights cooled early. They were ready this time. There was no panic in the gathering of firewood, no desperation in the jars sealed in the root cellar. Jonas moved slower, yes, his joints stiffening in the cold, but his presence remained steady as stone. One evening, as the first snow dusted the ground, Clara watched him from across the room. He sat at the table, Grace perched on his knee, her tiny hands tugging at his beard. Jonas chuckled, a sound so rare it startled her. Clara's throat tightened. She had never thought she'd see this, her child laughing in the arms of a man who once terrified her. When Grace finally dozed against his chest, Jonas looked up at Clara. Their eyes met, and for the first time she saw no wall between them, only belonging. The past still whispered. Sometimes Clara woke from dreams of her mother's wagon dragging her away, of her father's voice branding her shame. But when she opened her eyes, Jonas was there, his steady breath beside her, Grace's soft cries breaking the night. Those ghosts no longer ruled her. The mountain had given her something her family never had choice. And she chose this. Chosen love, carved from pain, chosen family, built from ruin, chosen freedom, fought for with everything she had. The girl who had been thrown away no longer existed. In her place stood a woman who knew her worth, a mother who knew her strength, and a partner who had finally found someone to stand beside him in silence that no longer hurt. Seasons passed on the mountain like the turning of pages in a book Clara never wanted to end. Each year left its marks, rings in the trees, lines at the corners of her eyes, new scars on Jonas's hands. Yet for all the hardship, each year also brought something precious. Grace's first words, Samuel's first successful hunt, the slow but steady weaving of their lives into something unshakable. By the time Grace was 5, the cabin had doubled in size. Jonas built an addition with Samuel's help, rough timber walls smoothed by their hard work. Clara painted the wood with herbs to keep pests away, humming songs she remembered from childhood. Inside, shelves lined with jars filled the pantry, quilts stacked neatly in the loft, and toys carved from wood littered the floor. It wasn't just a cabin anymore. It was a home, full of echoes and laughter, warmth and safety. Grace grew quickly, curious about everything. She chased butterflies through the meadow, asked endless questions about the stars, and often clung to Jonas's beard with stubborn devotion. He pretended to grumble, but Clara saw the way his heart softened each time Grace looked at him. One evening, Grace climbed into his lap and asked, "Papa, why are your hands so rough?" Jonas blinked, surprised. He had never claimed that word, never asked for it. But Clara watched as he swallowed hard, then wrapped his big hands gently around Grace's. "Because they've worked hard," he said softly, "but they'll always be gentle with you." Clara's throat tightened. In that moment, no court, no preacher, no town could take away what they had built. Grace had given Jonas the name of father, and he had accepted it with quiet reverence. Samuel grew taller. His boyish frame stretched into that of a young man. By 16, he could outpace Jonas in the woods, his aim steady, his confidence sure. He began to speak of building his own cabin someday, of carving out a place of his own. Clara felt both pride and grief at the thought. She had spent so long protecting him, and now he was ready to step into the world himself. One night, as she mended Grace's dress, Samuel sat by the fire and said, "Clara, I think I'll go down to town in the spring. The marshal says there's work, says I could help him." Clara's hand stilled. "You'd be leaving us." Samuel gave a crooked smile. "Not leaving, just starting." Jonas clapped a heavy hand on his shoulder. "The world needs men who stand for something. If you're ready, go." Samuel's eyes glistened as he looked at them both. "I wouldn't be ready if not for you." Clara hugged him tightly, her tears falling into his hair. "You'll always have a home here. Don't forget that." "I won't," he promised. Years stretched on. Grace grew into a strong young woman, her spirit wild as the river she loved to wade in. She learned to hunt with Jonas, to heal with Clara, to fight with Samuel before he left. She carried all of them inside her, and Clara often thought that her daughter was proof of survival turned into legacy. Jonas slowed as the years passed. His hair turned silver, his steps heavier. But his eyes remained sharp, his hands still steady when he held Clara's. They didn't need many words. Their silence had transformed long ago into a language all its own. One autumn evening, Clara found him sitting by the fire, Grace's latest carving in his hands. It was a bird, wings outstretched. "She's better than me now," Jonas murmured. Clara smiled, pressing a kiss to his temple. She had a good teacher. He looked at her then, his gaze heavy with years and love. "Never thought I'd live to see all this. Never thought I'd deserve it." Clara took his rough hand in hers. "We don't get what we deserve, Jonas. We get what we fight for." Winter returned harsher than it had in years. Snow buried the trail, ice thickened on the roof, and the fire burned longer each night. Jonas grew weaker, coughing more often, his breath shorter. Clara stayed at his side, pressing warm cloths to his chest, whispering stories to ease him through the nights. Grace refused to leave him, sitting on the floor with her hand wrapped around his. "Papa," she whispered one night, "don't go." Jonas's eyes shone. "Not yet, little bird." But Clara knew. She had seen enough sickness to recognize when the body was loosening its grip. The night he passed, the fire burned low. He held Clara's hand, his voice faint. "You saved me, you know." She shook her head, tears streaming. "No, Jonas, you saved me." A ghost of a smile curved his lips. "Then maybe we saved each other." His grip loosened, his breath faded, and Jonas slipped quietly into the silence he had carried all his life. Clara wept against his chest. Grace curled beside her, their grief heavy, but full of love. The years that followed were different, quieter, but not empty. Grace grew into adulthood, strong and kind. Samuel returned often, a lawman now, his shoulders straight with purpose. Clara aged with them, her hair silver, her back bent, but her spirit never broke. She told Grace stories of Jonas, how he had once been feared, how he had learned to love, how he had carved a life from the ashes of despair. Grace listened wide-eyed, treasuring every word as though it were scripture. Sometimes Clara walked the ridge at dusk, looking out over the valley. The wind carried Jonas's memory there, not in words but in the steady hush of the trees, the strength of the mountain itself. One evening as she stood there, Grace came beside her, tall now, her eyes bright. "Do you ever regret it?" Grace asked softly. Clara smiled faintly. "Not for a moment. My pain gave me you, my banishment gave me him, and together it gave us this." She gestured to the cabin, to the smoke rising from its chimney, to the land that had once been nothing but wilderness and was now the heart of their lives. Grace slipped an arm around her. Then we'll keep it, always. Clara lived to see grandchildren chasing fireflies in the meadow. She lived to hear Samuel called sheriff, to see Grace marry a kind man who knew how to laugh with his whole soul. She lived long enough to know that the curse of her past had been broken forever. On her final night, Clara lay by the fire, wrapped in quilts, Grace and Samuel at her side. Her breathing was shallow, but her smile was strong. "Promise me," she whispered. "Promise me you'll keep telling the story, not of my shame, of my survival." Grace squeezed her hand. "We promise." Clara closed her eyes, the warmth of the fire against her cheek, and felt the mountain's hush settle around her. She saw Jonas there, waiting, his hand outstretched. And with peace in her heart, Clara followed him into the silence, leaving behind not just survival, but a legacy. Her story had begun as punishment. It had ended as proof. The world may have tried to banish her, but the mountain gave her back to herself. And in doing so, it gave her everything. Thank you for listening to Clara's journey. For more powerful tales of resilience and survival, don't forget to subscribe to Stories Untold.